Thank you all. And here is Loretta Ross to share more rich information with us.
Can you see me? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you so much.
Okay. Assuming yes to both of those questions. Well, let me switch gears. The earlier presentation I gave was on reproductive justice. The one that I'm going to do now is called Calling in the Calling Out Culture. That's the title of a book I've just written that'll be released later this year. But I want to talk about what is calling in and why I'm an advocate of it. And first, how did I get here? As you know, my name is Loretta Ross. I do social justice activism work. I've been doing that for more than 50 years, 51 to be exact, because I'm 67 years old now. And one of the things that I learned as a social justice activist is that I've made a lot of mistakes as I've done this work, and the way that my mistakes were handled had a definite impact on whether I continued to do the work. And it reminds me of my childhood because if you were a child and when you made a mistake, if your family of origin punished you for those mistakes, then you assume that punishing others for their mistakes is the way to do the right thing. But if your family of origin helped you learn from your mistakes without punishment, without judging you, but just saw each mistake as a learning opportunity, then that actually predicts whether or not you're able to use calling in your tool belt. And so, having said that, the mistakes I made when I was young were those that people forgave me for. They didn't dispose of me because I'd made a mistake, even when some of those mistakes were quite serious. And so I've decided that teaching about calling in now is what my mission in life is, mainly because I'm standing on the shoulders of many giants who didn't give up on insufferable me, and because I believe that how we do the work is as important as the work that we do. And so I'm going to share a PowerPoint. If you give me a minute to get to it. Just give me a second. For some reason, my computer is going very slow. Okay. Now let me go back to share screen. Sorry about that. My computer just goes really slow when it wants to. I'm always complaining about AT&T. So hopefully you can see that screen. Can someone speak up and tell me whether they can see it or not?
We can see it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. So I got to calling in the calling out culture because my grandson, when he was about 10 or 12 years old, absolutely refused to answer his phone. And it wasn't that he didn't answer the phone, but he basically said, "Well, Grandma, if you want to talk to me, you need to either text me or get on Facebook." Well, I didn't know how to text at the time, so I got on Facebook. And of course, the minute I got on Facebook, he migrated off to TikTok or WhatsApp or something. But I stayed on Facebook, and what I noticed was how mean people were to each other. And so I asked some young people around me what was going on. And they said, "Oh, you mean the calling out culture?" I said, "You named it?" And they said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, what are y'all doing about it?" And the young person I was talking to, Marissa Graciosa at the time, said, "I don't know." And she shrugged her shoulders. And so I began to review what was at that time 45 years worth of social justice organizing and realized how many times people had called me in, how many times I had called people out. and whether or not we could do something differently about it. Obviously, I've had a lot of opportunities. I'm a rape survivor. I had to raise a child born of incest. And then I was sterilized when I was 23 years old. And my activism began at 16, basically involved in anti apartheid and anti gentrification work in Washington, D.C. During my career, I've been in a lot of positions. I co directed the March for Women's Lives in Washington, D.C. in 2004, which at that time was the largest protest in history. I retired from the Sister Song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective in 2012. I've also monitored hate groups as the program research director at the Center for Democratic Renewal, National Anti-Klan Network, and within the feminist movement, I started their Women of Color program. And my favorite work was at the Center for Democratic Renewal, National Anti-Klan Network, where I had the opportunity and the privilege to work with the late Reverend C.T. Vivian. You may recall that Reverend Vivian died the same day as John Lewis last year. Currently, I'm a visiting professor at Smith College. That means I spend a lot of time in the media on calling in. You can see that was a clip from Morning Joe, and that's another clip from CBS News. And I apologize for my hair because I have these long dreads and they always just do their own thing. Sometimes I'm proud of how they look. Sometimes I'm appalled. I have written 3 books on reproductive justice, on and on. So first, I want to start by quoting Nannie Helen Burroughs, who was an educator at the beginning of the 20th century, and she said, "Sow a thought and reap a deed. Sow a deed and reap a character. Sow a character and reap a destiny." And I think calling in is that process of understanding which destiny do you want in life, and you get to sculpt that destiny because activism is the art of making your life matter, and you get to choose what kind of activist you want to be. And of course, Nannie Helen Burroughs, who you people know, uh, talked about the 3 B's of education because at the same time, she started her school in Washington, D.C. from 1909 to 2013. She, of course, passed, but the school closed down in 2013. And then there was the Sedalia, North Carolina, Charlotte Hawkins Brown started the Palmer Memorial Institute. And of course, Mary McLeod Bethune started Bethune Cookman University in 1904. Now, I do this work with a purpose because I am building, and hope you join me in building, a human rights movement. Obviously, I'm part of the women's rights wing of the human rights movement, but I'm also disabled, so I care about the disability rights wing because I'm dedicated to anti-racial, anti-white supremacist work. I'm also part of the civil rights wing. Obviously, I don't have enough space to put all the circles up there, but we are all sectors of the same human rights movement. And so it doesn't make sense that we're fighting each other when in actually we're fighting our co-collaborators or our co-conspirators in the human rights movement. So basically, let me start by defining what is calling in. It is a way to get accountability by doing it with radical love. So basically, a calling in is a calling out done with radical love and respect so that you can achieve accountability, but you do so as if you're holding people's hearts in your hand. And this begins with giving each other the benefit of the doubt. Don't assume the worst. If somebody says a word that you don't agree with or shares a perspective that you don't agree with, and really, since we're all diverse people on the same human rights team, we're supposed to have differences of opinion with each other because calling in is this emerging practice that recognizes what matters most and that we need to invest in each other for our mutual growth and benefit. When you start calling in, you provide yourself an opportunity for self reflection, to make apologies, for things that you've done in the past, to offer to repair the harm you've done in the past, and committing to change your behavior. This requires remembering the broader context because what somebody said that was problematic when they were 16 is not the standard that they should be judged by when they're 66. We all did stupid things as teenagers. Some of us continue to do stupid things as elderly people, but our lives shouldn't be dictated by someone using our mistakes or our stupid behaviors as their own gotcha moments to try to out us or cancel us and those kinds of things. So that's why the broader context matters. And you need to stay calm sometimes and ask people to clarify what they mean. And you can do that with a simple calling in sentence of, when you said that word, I'm not sure if I understood what you meant by it. Do you mind if we go out and have coffee to talk about it? If you stay calm, you can ask people to explain themselves if you do so with love and respect and not accusation and judgmentalism. And it does require active, loving listening practices because you have to be able to put what you want to respond to what they say in the parking lot while you pay close and careful attention to them. And always be grateful for this opportunity for shared learning and being better together. I'm sorry, I went backwards. Calling in is a continuum, actually. It's not just a binary. You can call somebody out, and calling somebody out is an invitation to a fight, basically. I am jumping down your throat because you did what you said, what you misgendered me, you didn't do this, or you just didn't agree with me when I wanted you to agree with me. That's a calling out. Calling on is an intermediate step. That's where you make no investment in the person at all, but you are calling on them to be a better person or to do better. My favorite calling on sentence is, I beg your pardon. And you just let that lay there while the person reviews in their head what they just said or did. And quite often, they will want more conversation on it. And then it's your choice whether you want to offer them that conversation or not. Calling in is what I'm mostly fond of, though, because when I'm doing a calling in, that means I'm committing to invest in somebody else's growth and helping to strengthen their emotional intelligence and my own emotional intelligence. But the thing I'm offering you is that you have no obligation to do any of these things. You can just simply walk away. But I'm saying we shouldn't have calling out as the first thing we grab from the toolbox because you're not a hammer and everything ain't a nail. Calling on is a good intermediate step, as I said, and calling in is where you're actually taking time and patience to invest in someone else's growth. I think it's really important that we make our values real. And I'm sorry I got this padilla up here because that was the last time I used this slide. But anyway, we're in a lot of institutions where we're trying to provide transformative practices in education, and we're teaching these radical concepts without people learning transformative practices. And so, again, I pulled up the wrong deck, so my apology. But anyway, whether you're in a school or an organization, your philosophical vision must shape your content and action. And not all people within your organization know what a truly transformative and progressive process or education or organization can be. So we need to use calling in school skills to help people develop that. And staying politically neutral on a situation is a statement itself that you're trying to be apolitical, and in fact, you're being silent on injustices. And so, with the calling in continuum, you're trying to make a long-term investment in knowledge and the critical skills of inquiry because you're trying to empower people and you're building historical literacy and creating a lifelong commitment to justice. And you want to develop deep moral character, not just political perspectives, but guideposts for things that come up that you haven't encountered before. I don't think it should be optional within an organization or a school. Uh, it should be required. And the thing that light thing is is obscuring is that we need to understand our human interdependence with each other by developing empathy for others as part of our own integrity and our love for ourselves. We also need to learn to make better threat assessments to distinguish between debate, discomfort, microaggressions, offensives, and threat. So every time somebody says something that makes us uncomfortable doesn't mean they're threatening our lives. It is possible to listen to someone with whom you disagree without agreeing with them because you're just listening. And we need to normalize a calling in culture. Septima Clark was a community organizer in South Carolina. And she says that I believe unconditionally in the ability of people to respond when they are told the truth. We need to be taught to study rather than to believe, to inquire rather than to affirm. And I think a large part of the call out culture is being driven because someone we trust tells us what to think, and then we start thinking that thing without doing any kind of independent investigation or research ourselves. As we say in academia, we need people who are more invested into research instead of me search. I am sorry. I'm going to stop this share because this is not working when you pull up the wrong deck. Let me try this again. I am so sorry, y'all. It's not fair to y'all that y'all have to look at the wrong deck. So let me go down here. This is so embarrassing. Let me start sharing again. Okay. Okay, then. Anyway, the right wing has its opinion about the call out culture. And of course, when they featured it at the Republican National Convention, they said that call out culture or cancel culture was a top priority. Of course, Donald Trump tried to claim that he'd been canceled when Twitter ended his account and Facebook took him off of his account, where he was able to summon the mob in an insurrection against the Capitol. They claim that the left is promoting a new witch hunt, a new McCarthyism, which is kind of ironic because they were the original people getting people canceled from their jobs and sometimes costing them their lives. And they believe that the left is too coddled, too sensitive, as we demand that the habits that they have gotten away with for so long are just ended. It's no longer acceptable that people will be racist, homophobic, transphobic, and sexist at work. That's no longer acceptable. So the things that you used to get away with, where you would tell those kind of, racist jokes or make those sexist comments to women or queer people and all of that, that's no longer acceptable. We're not being too sensitive. We're actually demanding accountability. And they really do believe that we can't tolerate their ideas. Actually, it's not for lack of tolerance of their ideas that they don't like. They don't like the fact that we don't agree with their ideas. And of course, they believe that we should be ignoring all the hierarchical power structures because they should have the right to say whatever they want to, and people shouldn't be punished for making sexist, racist, homophobic, transphobic, or xenophobic comments. And we shouldn't be so thin-skinned. And of course, they ride this horse of white grievance anxiety, where they're saying that white heterosexual men are the principal victims, but all conservatives, sorry for the typo, are vulnerable and they should have the freedom to discriminate. They call that religious freedom. So if I'm the county clerk, I have the right not to allow a gay couple, a same-sex couple to be married, those kinds of things. Yet at the same time, they don't recognize that those of us who are fighting for reproductive rights and abortion are saying, well, I have the religious freedom not to have your religion imposed upon my body. And they basically say that leftists are unfairly using call outs to criticize our US allies. What the left believes is that, of course, the McCarthy's witch hunts began in the 1940s until the late 1950s, and it cost people their jobs and things like that. But it really, our critique of the call out culture really escalated when we saw leftist professors like Angela Davis get fired in 1970, and there's still campaigns to rid liberal universities of professors, including Lisa Durden, who was fired from Essex Essex County College for saying Black Lives Matter on Fox News. And of course, they've always campaigned against those things that they think Hollywood does that violate their religious sensibilities, like the Passion of Christ or the Chronicles of Narnia, or even Harry Potter claiming that it promoted witchcraft. And rock and roll and rap music is always criticized by the right and wants to be canceled, and sometimes they do, even imprisoning people for what they sing about. And we believe that public shaming is a valuable tool of the human rights movement because it may be the only way to reach inaccessible and unaccountable people who violate people's human rights. We talk about something called democratic speech environments within the left, and that's a concept that we should be exploring more because it's about free speech with conditions, basically supporting democracy and people's rights to justice and equality versus using free speech to violate people's human rights. Because we acknowledge that words can wound people. And in fact, they are most often used to reinforce social inequalities. And the only time the right criticizes the call out culture. As a matter of fact, when the previous victims start punching them up because we won't take it anymore. And it's motivated by a desire to hang on to white supremacist power and maintain an unjust hierarchy. And, people get canceled all the time when going against the powers that be. I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago called The Nazification of the Republican Party, basically just saying if you don't want to be associated with Nazis, scrape them off. Stop hanging out with Nazis. And then that caused Facebook to cancel my account because I said the word Nazi. And then I got a lot of trolls and stuff like that. But James Baldwin says it very well. He says, I've always been struck in America by an emotional poverty so bottomless and a terror of human life, of human touch, so deep that virtually no American appears able to achieve any viable organic connection between his public stance and his personal life. And for us in the calling in culture, what that means that people on the inside see themselves as much better people than they behave on the outside. Because interiorly, we'll use things like goodness and kindness. I'm nice to people. I'm nice to animals. I don't have a racist bone in my body on the inside, and then you behave externally that in a way that contradicts all of that. So you vote for racist candidates, you're mean to people, you call on, like Barbecue Becky calling cops on people for simply barbecuing in a park. But I bet you Barbecue Becky thinks inside that she's a really nice person. That's called cognitive dissonance, when your interior narrative doesn't match your public behavior. And I think the best calling in practice is to lead on people's interior narrative so that they themselves understand that they like to be as good on the outside as they are on the inside. But when we focus on the exterior behavior, the wrong words that they use, or jump down their throats for their beliefs, did we miss a chance to call them in and reinforce that interior goodness because we're only emphasizing and focusing on the external things that we find problematic. Uh, Free speech is something that we're debating on college campuses a lot. because there's been a real increase in anti Semitic, racist, transphobic, homophobic, and sexist events on college campuses. And we proved that words can wound. And the material threat is from the deeds that flow from the words. And on campuses, a lot, we're seeing verbal abuse, offensive emails, uh, the use of social networking sites to threaten people, vandalism, threatening behavior because of the way someone dresses or the gender pronouns that they choose to use, microaggressions, intentional and unintentional. Sometimes assaults are are physically assaulted, and the faculty or staff sometimes commits the abuse or show indifference when the N word or other transphobic, homophobic, or ableist things are said, and the campus authorities don't know what they're dealing with, so they further the harm. And they don't offer guidance for these institutes, for these incidents. And of course, there's always the risk of violence, protest. I'm not going to get into democratic speech environments because of a lack of time. What I can do is provide the organizers this PowerPoint so that it can be shared with the participants. Toni Morrison talks about, I know the world is bruised and bleeding, and though it's important not to ignore its pain, it's also critical to refuse to succumb to its malevolence. Like failure, chaos contains information that can lead to knowledge, even wisdom, like art. So, the really important thing about calling in practices is understanding your circle of influence, or what I call don't waste your time. Most of us on this call, on this webinar today, are probably 90 percenters. We have a common language that we use, we have our common isms that we fight, like racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, neoliberalism, ableism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Our biggest problem as 90 percenters is that we're busy trying to turn the 90 percenters into 100 percenters. And that's why we spend so much time calling each other out, because we think that somehow people are supposed to be perfectly aligned in order to do work with each other. And that is a false narrative. It is an assumption, because if people were perfectly aligned, we'd be clones. We wouldn't be the independent individuals that we are. One of my favorite sayings is that when many different people think many different thoughts and they move in the same direction, that's a movement. But when many different people think the same thought and they move in the same direction, that's a cult. And we're not building the human rights cult. Outside of our 90% bubble, that high unity bubble where we all agree on the isms, even though we have different strategies to work on them, are the 75 percenters. For me, as an abortion rights activist, the 75 percenters for me would be people like the Girl Scouts who work on women's empowerment and girls' empowerment, but probably wouldn't lead a troop to defend an abortion clinic, though I wish they would. And anyway, not only do they not use that 90% elite language that we use, but they're actually probably repelled by it when we try to impose it on them and criticize them and call them out for not being as woke as we are, because that happens a lot. Outside of the 75 percenters or the 50 percenters, these are people like my parents or people like your neighbors who could go either to the left or the right. And it's very important, if you're going to speak to those neighbors, to go underneath their words and discern what their values are and speak specifically to their values, so that put in a parking lot somewhere the thing you heard that you thought you disagreed with or that offended you, so that you can actually try to understand why they're saying that word are those words. I always ask that when the N word comes up out of the lips of white people. To me, the key question is the use of the word, but why would you use it? What's going on inside of you that makes you want to say that word? And so that's the question that I want to ask of all 50 percenters. when I'm coming from my 90% position trying to communicate with them. Okay, you believe that immigrants are bad for this country? What's going on with you and in your life that makes you believe that kind of inquiry? We can always respectfully make as a calling in practice. Outside of the 50 percenters or the 25 percenters, now, those of us who live in red state, this is probably the majority of the people who voted for Trump. And again, this is not numerical size indicated by this chart, but degree of agreement we have with them as a 90 percenter. I would argue that there's not a lot of common ground between me and a 90 percenter because my definition of freedom may be freedom from infection if they refuse to wear a COVID mask, and their definition of freedom is going to be the right not to wear a mask, for example. But that doesn't mean that everybody in the 25% is a racist, is a Nazi, or anything like that. But they certainly hang out with the racists and the Nazis that are in the 0% thing. And and those are the people with whom I am unalterably opposed because they're trying to overthrow democracy. They do not believe in equality of people. They're openly Nazis and white supremacists. And so I don't even try to reach out to them because what's more likely to succeed is that as a 90 percenter, I can influence the 75 percenters, and the 75 percenters are more likely to influence the 50 percenters. The 50 percenters are more likely to influence the 25, and the 25 has a remote chance of influencing the zeros. But our problem over the last 50 years has been the influence hasn't been going from the left to the right, but from the right to the left. And so the 0 percenters are the ones that have marched their ideas around racism and white supremacy and sexism and transphobia and all that stuff from the margins to the center, so that what used to be the ideas of the far right are now the public policies of the Republican Party. And I think we spent too much time trying to flip the zeros into being strategic and reaching out to those that are more adjacent to us. And Karl Popper, who was an Austrian scientist, a scientist and philosopher, said, "I may be wrong and you may be right, and by an effort, we may get nearer to the truth." So if you're going to try to work from the 90% to the 50%, understand your circle of influence by don't overstating the harm that you're experiencing and don't let them overstate the harm that they're experiencing. And you do this by taking their pain and suffering very seriously. They are as complicated as we are. Everyone is complicated. There are many people who do harm and also do good at the same time. Matter of fact, I'm convinced that the most complicated art comes from the most complicated people who are really sucky people. But, that's a different conversation. We also can't lead with our own narratives viewed only through a trauma victim lens, and neither can we actually accept that they will do so. But that's why you go underneath those lenses to find out what's really going on with them. Sometimes facts do matter, and sometimes they can be wooed away from a position by facts by someone they trust. I think it's important to normalize a calling in culture so that people are not afraid that if they tell their truth, they're going to be jumped on. And it also makes people who are bystanders, want to participate in a conversation because bystanders can be very afraid that they're going to be the next ones jumped on. And we can create a sense of joy and belonging to the human rights movement, which is really important. I want to look at my time. Okay, it's 2 o'clock. And you can do so by using examples that resonate with their lived experiences and reinforcing that positive self image they have of themselves. But you have to avoid name calling or calling out tactics. As Audre Lorde says, and I'm not going to take the time to read this, I'll let you read it yourself. But you don't have to be me in order for us to fight alongside each other. So why would we want to create a calling in culture in the first place? I think we want to hold people accountable, but with radical love and with integrity. I think we want to build a human rights society where inclusion and not exclusion is the norm. We want to bring more people into the human rights movement by uniting our identity based movements while not sacrificing specificity. I think we need to create a warm and welcoming atmosphere where people get information and they get fulfilled in being the best people that they can be. And it's really important to understand that how we do the work is as important as the work that we do. And this starts with self reflection and self correction. And I'm trying to figure out why, in the human rights movement, we're so busy opposing the prison industrial complex, but we replicate its tactics within our own movement and create these oppressive spaces. This, by the way, is not nothing new. In the 1970s, we in the feminist movement used to call this trashing. And this is a quote from Doreen, who used to be known as Joe Freeman, where she talked about trashing as a particular vicious form of character assassination. Basically, it's psychological rape. It's manipulative, dishonest, and excessive. It's occasionally disguised by the rhetoric of honest conflict. Oh, I'm not picking on you. I just think we disagree. But are they covered up by denying that any disapproval exists at all? But it's not done to expose disagreements or resolve differences. It's done to disparage and destroy. So here in 1976, Joe Freeman wrote this, and now we're getting to calling out. Because that's what it's called now, which is where you're criticizing other social justice practices while not being so critical of your own. You're publicly using knowledge as a weapon. You're banishing people, think, seeing people as disposable simply because they're not, quote, woke enough. Sometimes some bad faith people use calling out to boost their ego or their standing in community. We call that virtue signaling, signaling how woke you are and how great you are, and jumping down people's throats because they aren't as woke or as great as you are. And then this false search for political purity of opinion is just that, like there's some immaculately virtuous opinion that one can have. And then we usually use shaming and ideological bullying to accomplish that. There's a wonderful trans woman named Natalie Wynn that's done a taxonomy of counseling or calling out culture and how it gets magnified because it starts with the presumption of guilt instead of a presumption of innocence. So you can start off by saying, so and so did something that was sexist. And then that quickly gets abstracted into then attacking their character. So and so didn't do something that was sexist. Not only did they do something that was sexist, but they are in fact a sexist dog. And so you went from the behavior of the words that you're criticizing into attaching it to their character, to their humanity. And that's how quickly the abstraction takes place. And we could use all kinds of words like toxic, manipulative, racist, sexist, transphobic, turf, all these kind of words that attack people's character based on the perception that they've done something wrong and a presumption of guilt because you may not have even witnessed the wrongdoing. You just heard about them being that thing and you've just fallen into line. And it always proceeds from a pseudo moralistic stance, as if you're the one who has a superior knowledge and you're just telling all the unwoke people what they need to know and how they need to think about a person, even a pseudo intellectualism, where they wrap you in all of these words that we all learning in the leftist movement and then pretend that everybody who doesn't agree with us has to be that thing we're calling them toxic, manipulative, and ill-informed, or what have you. The other exaggeration is that it creates a culture of unforgivability. So no matter how sincere the apology is, no, well, first they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. Because if they offer an apology, they're going to be seen as gaming the system. trying to manipulate people. But if they don't offer an apology, then they're seen as trying to escape accountability. And so it's definitely a catch 22. And then it leads to this guilt by association process. So if so and so is accused of saying something sexist and being a sexist, well, Loretta, if you have lunch with that sexist dog, you must be sexist too. And so it makes people shun others and stay away from them for fear of contamination. And it all rests on a dualistic system of false binaries: good, evil, gay, straight, right, wrong, stuff like that, which is a legacy of many religious traditions that we practice in this country, but they're not apt descriptors of reality, because reality is far more nuanced than these false binaries allow. And so it becomes toxic by replicating the carceral system of punishment and discouraging people. And it frightens people not into speaking up by driving them away from the movement. And actually, people weaponize their privileges like they weaponize their language to call people out. And of course, why would one want to admit that you've ever made a mistake if someone's going to jump down your throat for admitting it? Again, if someone jumped down your throat for your mistakes, that's probably why you feel it's okay to jump down other people's throats, because it's going to make accountability different. So if people know that they're going to be pilloried for admitting that they made a mistake. And I think in that way, it increases the harm rather than the healing, and it gaslights people by devaluing their lived experiences. Even if they've committed harm, you can still figure out, that they are worth talking to and figuring out why it happened. And when you dispose of people, you isolate them. And most deadly is the culture of cynicism and hopelessness that's created. There's a lot of reasons why people call out. Let me look at my time. I'm gonna go on for about 2 more minutes, and then we'll have 45 minutes worth of discussion. Sometimes they want to end the abuse. They want to respond to the harm, draw attention to invisible or unmarked situations, establish their superiority over another by showing off their knowledge, seek positive attention, define who's the in crowd, maybe influence others to compete for power and respect. Sometimes they want to disguise their own shortcomings, and they don't know how to give constructive criticism. So they just pounce on people. And some people are living very isolated existences, so that I think that they're trying to create an online community of support that they lack in real life, but it actually is an immature way to offer criticism by making people follow the rules that you set. And of course, we just ended the presidency of the biggest projectionists in American society when they project their behaviors onto others. I'm going to run through these because, again, this is far more than you need, so that I can close with this one. Calling in, of course, is a call out done with radical love. I've said this before, and so let's read this. Yeah. And here's some steps that you can take. You can analyze how you feel, you can define what is achievable. It always starts with self assessment, because you have to be in that emotional space to call people in, or even to call on them to be better. And if you're in a place where you're still feeling wounded, when you're still feeling that no one has paid attention to your needs, that means you're probably not in a space to be a effective person for calling people in, because it's not the obligations of the people who are harmed to help someone else grow. But sometimes you're in a sufficiently healed space so that you can be the person trying to call people in. And then you need to decide, well, what do I want to achieve by calling this person in? What am I trying to, who am I trying to reach, and what I'm trying to do if I reach them? And what will be different if I call this person in? And it's really important to be clear to define the change that you desire and what will help you get to that change. Sometimes you're not the person to make the intervention. You have to choose the right messenger, because sometimes A guy calling in another guy works better than a woman calling in another a guy, that kind of thing. So I'm going to stop the share here. I've been talking for a while and open it up for discussion.
Thank you so much. Just to remind folks, you can click the raise hand feature at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen to raise your hand, and you can then speak directly and ask your question. And then I know you can, of course, there's also the Q&A chat, which we already have some questions that folks have typed in. So getting right into gear, someone asked, they said, I think there's a tendency for some people to encourage calling in culture because they assume it will allow them to be held less accountable for their actions, or because it leads with kindness and they won't have to actually grow or change. Similar to how some are comfortable discussing their implicit biases, but are hesitant to reflect on their explicit biases. How would you suggest we use the calling in framework and let folks know that we still all need to do the work?
Well, calling in is not a process for evading accountability, and I tried to make that clear. But there's always going to be people operating in bad faith. No matter what system you use, they're going to try to game the system and get over. I mean, that, and those are the people I have no problem calling out, as a matter of fact. I mean, it's fairly simple for me. Everybody makes mistakes. And if you make a mistake and you don't want to be held accountable for it, even though you've had opportunities to learn from your mistake, but you double down on it, or you have that kind of behavior where you're trying to use calling in to manipulate others, I'm going to call you out. But if you make a mistake and you do want to do better and you're willing to learn from your mistake, then I'm much more likely to call you in. And so it's not letting people getting away with harm. It's choosing another approach to handle it. But yes, there are people who manipulate leftist language, calling in language, and all of that to evade responsibility for owning their stuff. And we shouldn't let them get away with it. Uh, but I have seen a lot of bad faith actors in both the left and the right. And we need to be clear.
Yeah. We'll give people some more time to, again, you can put your questions in the chat, or you're so encouraged to use the raise hand feature so you can ask directly. We're letting folks do that. Oh, we just had a question come in. Great. Someone asked, to clarify an earlier point, would you recommend that we don't attempt to call in and further engage with the 0%?
It depends on their relationship to you. I mean, because there may be someone who you have a relationship with who's politically in the 0%, and sometimes using the relationship can be a calling in opportunity. Um, my brother is not in the 0%, but I'm pretty sure he's in the 25%. I wouldn't be surprised if he voted for Trump. And he used to use the most racist invective around me around about Mexican Americans, because we were from San Antonio, and they would use the black people in San Antonio as a way to keep the Mexican Americans out of the economy. We were the buffer class, so to speak. And so he used to use all these awful words around me about Mexican Americans. And finally I just spoke to him. I said, honey, do you love me? And of course, I'm his baby sister, 17 years older than me. So, of course, he was going to say yes. And I knew that. I said, well, do you understand that every time you use those words, you hate me? You hurt me? And it took him aback because he thought as long as there was no Mexican American in the room, he was okay saying those words. And since then, and that happened in 1980, I've never heard those kind of words come out of my brother's mouth again. He may be privately thinking them, he may be saying them in other settings, but he doesn't say them around me or the family. And now we've got a situation where his children and his grandchildren don't hear him saying those words when he's around family. So sometimes you can do behavior modifications of even a 25%er by using other existing relationships you have with them, rather than try to, you know, do a DEI training with him on understanding how hateful it is to call Mexican Americans those names.
Thank you. And someone's asked, is there an appropriate time to call out instead of call in?
Well, again, using the system of, have they had a chance to do better and they choose not to? And I think that's real appropriate to call them out. Like I feel about the Republicans in Congress who didn't vote to impeach. They knew better and they chose not to. So there is severe risk of calling out every time they should, show their heads in public. Um, People who choose to commit harm and don't want to be accountable for that harm or repentant of that harm, I'm going to always call them out. People who choose to violate their oaths of office or who want to commit human rights violations against other people, yes, I'm going to call them out. So I'm not saying don't have calling out as an option. I'm saying don't let it be your first option when you don't give people the benefit of the doubt and explore who they are and what they mean before you pounce on their words.
Thank you. I think that's such a good delineation. So we have Heather who's going to ask her question. I think you should be able to unmute yourself, Heather. Might be having technical difficulties. Well, here we can. I'm not sure if you can hear me, Heather. I'm sorry. We'll come back to you and make sure your question gets answered. To go to another one for a minute while we get that worked out. Let's see, someone's asking, you mentioned that the workplace is an area where we should emphasize calling in. How do you go about this while emphasizing zero tolerance for hate speech?
Well, first of all, zero tolerance policies don't work anyway. So I would argue that that's an absolutist binary kind of thing, which I also speak against. And it's going to be a very subjective determination of what's called hate speech. So I'm not sure if I would want these hard and fast zero tolerance rules to guide people behavior, because the people who want to break the rules are going to break the rules anyway. It's just going to keep everybody else up for everybody else from speaking up. And so I don't know if that would be the approach I'd want. I think calling in cultures can be created at workspaces. And again, it's not about forbidding people's speech, but really going underneath and asking them, why would you want to say that? I mean, I know a half a dozen bad words for every ethnic group in America. Well, why would I want to use them? That's a question of your own integrity, not about your freedom. Yes, you have the freedom to be a jerk, but why would you want to? It's the question that I'm going to constantly ask. And then I get to decide whether I want to work with jerks or not. Uh, and managers are not going, we're at the point where what people previously got away with in workplaces so longer is tolerated. And so managers are certainly don't want the company or organization to be liable for not, correcting these kinds of behaviors now, when it could end up in a lawsuit and those kinds of things. So it's a fast shifting terrain that we're dealing with in our workplaces. Now, I probably say, though, you should pay attention to power differentials because it's still structurally very difficult to manage upward because you're trying to correct the behavior of someone who has power over you. And so you really need to think long and hard whether you're going to call in or out your boss and do a deep read of how receptive they may be to any approach that you make them, because you can't flatten out power differentials. You can't pretend that they don't exist, and you certainly can't pretend that they have consequences if you try to ignore them.
Thank you. All right. Stina, I think we have Stina here who has a question to ask if you want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, my question was about the comment you made regarding freedom of speech and cancel culture tension on campuses and at universities. In your experience, is that tension administration and versus like students, or administration versus professors? Where is that complexity coming in? And what can we do if we're not a part of that culture to help provide safe space?
Well, I'm of the opinion that colleges and universities have transitioned so dramatically over the last 50 or 60 years. Previously, uh, campuses were run by scholars and reformists, social reformists, trying to deal with producing a better citizen and a better, you know, body of knowledge and stuff like that. But since neoliberal capitalism has come to dominate the college atmosphere, we're being run by a lot of mid-level executives that are busy protecting the financial pyramid that our colleges are, and by exploiting both faculty and students. And so it's a different game nowadays. Um, and I think there's something tremendously wrong with it because we're financing this management class at our colleges, this class of managers and executives at our colleges on the back of student debt, while not necessarily offering a high quality educational product. And these managers are spending most of their time trying to restrain or constrain the students and the faculty rather than really work for the project of academic excellence and stuff like that. And so you get these people who are in charge that just make basic mistakes. Just make basic mistakes. Like I get called in by a lot of colleges that have allowed a Holocaust denier to come to college, for example. Well, it's just the battle of free speech and ideas. And I'm like, no, it is not just a battle of free speech and ideas. Would you invite somebody to your physics department that denies gravity exists? So why would you invite somebody to your humanities department that denies that the Holocaust happened? There's truth and then there's opinions. And if you're not, uh, all campuses should be preoccupied with finding the truth, not just entertaining opinions as stuff. But the fact that they are oblivious about their responsibilities under the First Amendment shows that they just have a different agenda. They have a different agenda in mind than the security and safety of the students, which should be their number one priority in creating a productive learning environment for the students.
Thank you. And I just love that point you made too about what their agenda, right? Like kind of sussing out their agenda within some of these decisions. So we have someone that's asked, do you have any advice on how to call in people that have more power than you? For example, potentially a client relationship.
Yeah, there's ways to do it, but like any other thing, before you play at Carnegie Hall, you might want to practice, practice, practice. So, uh, but there are ways to do it. Uh, One of the things I try to remember is some startup sentences that are like, that might say, when you use that word, I'm not sure what you meant. Do you mind us having coffee and you explaining it to me more? Or did you notice that in the meeting, the staff meeting we had yesterday, things got a little tense? What do you think was happening in that meeting? And blah, 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 blah. So instead of making accusation and judgment, you ask questions of inquiry so that you can get an idea or read of what this person is thinking, maybe going underneath their words and stuff, and then ascertain whether this is a person that needs to be called in, called on, or called out. But keep in mind that either way, you're risking something because of the power disparity. And the other thing that I needed to say is that we don't have that magical superpower of controlling other people's behavior. So you have to be willing to make the calling in or the calling out and then walking away because you don't have the power to make people change. If you could make people change, couples wouldn't fight. I mean, you just can't make people change. And so you have to take pride in what you offered, but not pride, not have the false pride of thinking that you actually flipped or changed somebody. But I say practice, practice, practice when it comes to calling in uh, over a power disparity.
Thank you so much. Oh, this is Interesting. So someone's asked, and reading their full, it's a bit of text, just as a heads up. So they asked, I find myself to be of a left libertarian persuasion. So maybe I am the like in the 85% here, smiley face emoji, but I believe I hold very progressive beliefs. I tend to believe that people only change their hearts and minds when they are exposed to something that resonates with them directly or a new idea that comes from someone they trust. But this more pacifist approach has rubbed a lot of my ultra progressive allies the wrong way. How can I help them know that I mean no harm and keep myself from getting called out just because I disagree with the approach?
Well, again, it's how you present it. If you present it with love and respect, then it's more likely to be heard. If you're presenting it with a haughty judgmentalism, then it's likely to be rebuffed. Um, and understand that people, as I said, are going to be as complicated as you are. And so sometimes the first time you present it, it won't work. The second time you present it, it won't work. And maybe the third time is the sweet spot. But um, I think that people try to manipulate people too much. And they don't, and unless you want to be known as a master manipulator, I keep asking, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to be so dishonest with people that you purport to care about? I don't understand it. And so there's a lot of work we can do with each other, but it starts with self assessment because you have to ask yourself, why am I doing this way? That's where it always starts because you have no control over changing another person, but you got every control over changing yourself. Particularly if it doesn't give you, if being the way you being doing it doesn't give you the results you want, you should be at least smart enough to figure out that you need to try another strategy.
All right, so I think we have somebody with their hand raised. Can we give, I think it's out Tammy permission to use, okay, there you go. Go ahead, Tammy.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. I was just wondering if you could expand more on the privilege being like used in the toxicity of call out culture. Because I feel like I've seen it happen, you know, when like people call out someone, usually they target people with marginalized identities a lot more often than those with less marginalized identities. I was wondering if that's what you were referring to, or if there was like more to that that point, because it was fascinating.
I would say all of the above because I've seen people who are afforded more respect to what the to because of who says what versus what they've said. You know, that's wrong. I've got that's conferring more legitimacy because of a social identity. It has nothing to do with the weight of what they said. I've seen the false humility of groups that say, well, I won't speak up. I don't want any white people speaking up till the people of color speak up. That's false humility. That's misusing privilege to make yourself feel good while you're still dictating who speaks up and who shouldn't. You know, I mean, that ain't giving away power. That's just using it in an act of false humility to make yourself feel better. You know, I have to be okay. I'm about to get in trouble with this one. I am so over land acknowledgments that ain't giving away no land. You know, I'm like, okay, this was the so and land of the so and so people, and even though I'm sitting up here and I'm not giving away an inch of land, I want to acknowledge that we stole it. I mean, what the hell? Somebody supposed to feel better from that? That's privilege in action. Then I know people who wrap themselves so securely in a victim mantle that they don't want to let any new information in because they think that victim mantle is working for them. So they end up being a fight, always looking for a place to happen. And they walk around with a very short fuse, always ready to blow up on somebody else. And that's another form of privilege. I'm not saying it's a privilege to become a victim, but when you weaponize your victimhood as a way to really do harm to others because hurt people, then you're actually using your victimhood status to bully other people. And that can be a manifestation of privilege, particularly when you know you can get away with it. Because that's what privilege is, doing things that no one can hold you accountable for. That kind of thing. And so there's many ways that privilege gets abused. I think we all fasten on white privilege, which of course is real. But at the same time, there's a lot of other ways: knowledge privilege, age privilege, gender privilege. All of those privileges are in our mix.
Thank you. And just so folks know, if you still are kind of formulating your question, you still have the raise hand function or can type it into the Q&A. We have time for, I'm estimating about 2 to 3 more, just so folks know. So someone's asked, well, they said, first of all, they said, thank you for presenting today. And asked earlier in the presentation, you had referenced trashing as the predecessor to calling out. Do you think we'll see calling out transform into something else going forward, or do you see calling in as a way to end this particular cycle?
No, I think people will always evolve new ways to mess with each other, because that seems to be a fundamental characteristic that is deeply within our human psyche that's flawed. Because someone was asking me about whether or not, if we had so many people who were mixed race, and so that we were indistinguishable between black and white and Asian and white, or Asian and black and stuff, would hatred go away? And I said no, because we probably figure out a way to discriminate people against people from those who had longer fingers than the others, or who had pointed ears versus rounded ears. I mean, until we get rid of our need to have hierarchies, we will always figure out a new way to have them. And that's what. So calling out will be eclipsed sometime by another word or something. But let's be clear: this whole human tendency to be judgmental and cancel people, I mean, it's as ancient as humanity. I mean, after all, Alexander Hamilton was killed in a call-out duel, so it's nothing new. At all. It's part of human behaviors. And I'm just asking the question for this particular moment: given the need to fight this fascist resurgence, shouldn't we in the human rights movement be working to try to do better?
Thank you. Someone's asked, could you speak more to the comparison of calling out to psychological rape? This is not a term I'd heard before, and I was curious about this particular language choice. Thank you.
Well, I actually disagree with Joe Friedman's use of the term psychological rape. The first rape crisis center was founded in 72, and that's the one I worked at. I came there in 79. And we had a tendency, which I really wish we hadn't done, to use overstated words back then, and like safe spaces and triggers and psychological rape. And they've gone out into the atmosphere to over describe harm that isn't even there. So I kind of wish we hadn't done it back then. But some things we did don't stand the test of time, and that would be one of those things. And so just because someone says something that I disagree with, it, I'm not going to call it psychological rape unless I'm so insecure about what I believe in that they're able to threaten or persuade me. Uh, and that just bespeaks what's going on within you rather than what they said. So I would probably not use that term now, even though I was accurately quoting Joe, because that's what we did in the 70s. We overstated harm, we overpromised safety, we overused the word triggers, and now we're in a big mess because of those overstatements.
That's so powerful about the way that narrative language like that can ripple out or evolve over time. Which, just so folks know, you can put, if you have more questions, we have time for 1 or 2 more. So I'll give folks a second to do that. And then this is a question or curiosity of mine. You mentioned at the top of kind of this talk about how a lot of call out culture happens on social media. I'm curious if you see those platforms as a place that can be conducive for call in culture, or if you think that has to happen in a different space.
it's not the medium, it's the people who use it. So yes, it can happen within social media, and it can happen in other spaces as well. Um, I caution people against what I call toxic doom scrolling, which is just a getting into a calling out chain and then just immersing yourself into it, participating in it. And I really ask you, how is that making your life happier? What is that doing for you? Why would you do it? Kind of thing. Not making a judgment, but just asking them to self acknowledge and self examine how well that's working for them. But you can call people out or in on social media. Uh, I rarely respond to a call out, whether it's of a third party or me on social media. But if I chose to, I try to offer some reflection, some reflection, like saying, um, I don't know why you would choose that word to describe another human being. What's going on with you? Try to redirect it back into them seeing their own behavior rather than projecting their behaviors on other people. But I don't do a lot of uh, I just don't do it. Social media for me is for spreading good information. Everything else needs to be done in real life, as far as I'm concerned. Now, I did have a situation where someone lied about me on social media, and it took everything in my power not to respond to that lie because I felt that that lie was forever hovering in cyberspace. And, my first impulse is that I needed to respond to them and cap them down and shoot them down and blah, blah, blah. And I'm glad I didn't. I'm glad I didn't. And so I just shot them a DM and said, well, it's interesting that you said that. And since I already know you have my phone number, I'm curious why you didn't pick up the phone and call me. And that's how I closed that situation down. So I didn't address the lie in cyberspace. I directly spoke to the person and let them know that I had noticed what you've done and that if you want to talk, you can call me. But the worst thing you can do to somebody is actually ignore them. And so I let them stew for a number of weeks before I DM'd them. So that was my petty revenge.
Taken notes. So someone, I think that was an example, and then someone also asked and mentioned that they really appreciated hearing the example of the conversation you'd had with your brother. And I think this is probably a good last question before we close today. Could you share another example of effective calling in that you've witnessed or engaged with?
Oh yeah. Um, where I teach at Smith College, we take exquisite pains to try to get people's gender pronouns correct. And so they when the students are enrolled, they send you this tape of who uses which pronouns and blah blah blah, and you're supposed to practice, 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 practice. Well, I have a problem. I have 50 or 60 students in each of my classes, so I can barely remember their names because of the size of my classes, and I never remember the gender pronouns right. It's a little bit easier with Zoom where they can put them there, but when it was in real life, I was hopeless and I made lots and lots of mistakes. And I try to correct myself, but I still kept making mistakes. And so finally, in one of my classes, I misgendered a student, and then I froze because I was expecting for the whole class to jump on me because we had worked so hard on trying to get this right. And the kids spoke up and said, "Hey, that's all right. I misgender myself sometimes." And he called me in. 18-year-old called me in by offering me grace and forgiveness when I was filled with fear and thought I was going to have somebody jump down my throat. And so that's an example of a calling in that I'll quote forever because this young man taught me what forgiveness looks like, taught me that what having a long fuse looks like, and taught me that, yeah, just keep working on it, keep getting better at it. I'm not going to jump down your throat because you made that mistake.
Thank you. And thank you so much for just sharing this time with us. I It's been really just wonderful to have this opportunity to hear and learn from you, and just really appreciate you just taking the time to share with us. And someone just responded, it might have been the person who asked, they said that example is so heartwarming. Thank you. Thank you from all of Metriarch and this Lady Charts conference. We've so valued this time, and we're really excited for your book that's coming out. I don't know if you wanted to share when it's being released real quick.
I wish I knew. It's in the hands of the publishers now, but they want to make money and they want to do it fast. So I got a feeling they're going to be rushing it out.
Oh, well, we are so excited to have the opportunity to read it soon. Thank you again so much for your time and sharing all of this wonderful information with us. It's really been invaluable, and we're so grateful to have gotten this slice of time with you. Thank you again.
All right, then. Bye-bye.